All right, well, we're going to get started here now, and we really appreciate you spending some time with us over your lunch hour. My name is Aaron Clems. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy, and I'm delighted to be your host today for From Fossil Fuels to Flash Floods, Who Should Pay for Minnesota's Climate Crisis, a webinar about the cost of climate change and who's paying for it right now and who should be paying. This conversation, like all of our webinars, is fueled by MCA supporters, and we want to thank you for your support. It allows us to continue to work on complex issues like this at the Minnesota Legislature and state agencies and in the courts. And if you're able to, please consider a contribution to make even more of this work available to others and to yourself. Now, I'm excited to introduce our panelists here in just a moment, but just to kind of set the stage, MCA has worked on climate action for many years. We've been this is for the long haul. We know that this is the issue, one of the most defining issues of our generation. And we set off in the 1990s with a really ambitious and kind of crazy goal at the time, which was to retire every coal plant that was producing electricity in the state of Minnesota. And we've been successful. Like that is now accomplished. At least retirement dates have been set, not just through MCA's work, but through the work of all the climate advocacy groups and people working across the state. And we are excited to be part of the ecosystem in this regard. We partner with local residents, tribal governments, conservation organizations, public health groups, and more in this work. And that's why we're really thrilled to be talking about this issue today with our key partners. Um, and what we have today to do really today is we're breaking it down in the following way. We're going to break down the cost of climate changes in Minnesota, how it's impacting our lives and our budgets, both as individuals and as a state. And we're also going to talk about how Minnesota and other states are trying to make sure that the biggest climate polluters are held responsible for causing it and are held accountable for paying for the cost of that pollution. We also want to make sure to answer your questions. And so at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A tab. If you click on that, you can drop questions into the Q&A box, and our panelists will attempt to get to those in the last 10 to 15 minutes of our conversation today. We're going to go for about an hour, and we'll end at the top of the hour at 1 o'clock. And in the chat, you'll also find some helpful links that are going to be placed along the way. So if you hear something, look in the chat, you might find the link that you're looking for. So as I mentioned before, I'm Aaron Clems. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at MCA, where I work on legislative and communications work. And I want to introduce our three panelists, we're really delighted to have them with us today. The first is Aurora Vatran. Aurora is the Legislative and Political Director at 100%, the organization that was formed in 2019 to try to get 100% clean energy electricity law passed in Minnesota, which we won, yay, in 2023. And 100% continues to work on climate issues and across the state of Minnesota. Thank you so much for being here today, Aurora. We appreciate it. Secondly, I'm going to introduce Representative Athena Hollins. Representative Hollins is a legislator from St. Paul, and she's also the DFL whip for the Minnesota House of Representatives. Representative Hollins is a powerful advocate for many things, but especially for environmental justice and climate action. We're really excited to have her with us today as well. And lastly, I want to introduce Lee Curry. Lee Curry is MCA's Chief Legal Officer. Lee previously worked for the Minnesota Attorney General's office, where she led the work against Minnesota's ongoing case. It continues to this day. In fact, there was a hearing this morning against big oil. Now she leads MCA's legal work on a host of environmental issues, including climate change. And thank you to Lee for being here. So let's get started. I want to start with this and this will be a chance for you to introduce yourself a little bit as well. Tell us a little bit about your work and your work on climate action, how you're feeling in this political moment, and as we look ahead to Minnesota's legislative session next year and think about what might be on the horizon for climate work in our state. And I want to start with Aurora, if you don't mind. Aurora, go ahead.
Wonderful. Thanks, Aaron. Happy to be here. Hi, everyone. My name is Aurora Vatran. I am the Legislative and Political Director at 100%, and my pronouns are she, her. I am tuning in from my neighborhood in South Minneapolis today, but I am a Duluthian, and I will still claim it no matter how long I haven't lived there. My phone number is still 218. My background is really in electoral work. 100% was my first sort of transition into sort of policy and climate work. Most of the issues that really politicized me are economic justice issues. And when you think about all of the problems in our world, there isn't really a way that climate change doesn't make them worse, right? Like all of the problems we have are exacerbated by the climate crisis. So I am not a scientist. I don't have a academic background in climate or science or math. You don't want me to do math. But really, 100% was all about um, having everyone join in the fight the way that they could, realizing, right, that like we were going to need more than just the scientists. Like we need the scientists, absolutely. They are very important. And fighting the climate crisis is going to take everybody. And so when I signed on to this job, the fact that I did not have a background in climate was not a problem. I was an organizer, right? And I think like that is a reason why 100% has had a lot of success in the things that we've passed. Um, I right now at 100% we're thinking a lot about building decarbonization, right? So the 100% bill got us a plan to get to 100% carbon free by 2040. But there's five other sectors that we don't currently have a plan for, right? So we are digging into building decarbonization. There's a lot of really important work happening on transportation, and we'd like to help there well where we can. But a new lane for us that we have really sort of dug into in the last few years is this idea about climate revenue. So when we talk about our decarbonized future, right, it's not like our status quo just decarbonized. Like so often when we talk about the climate crisis, we talk about all we have to lose, right? And it's doom and gloom. And I think the only reason why I have been able to keep this job for 6 years without burning out and getting totally depressed and quitting is because we are really grounded in this idea that like we have an opportunity to fix everything. Well, we have to fix everything. So we really come at this work from an angle of like hope and possibility. And I think that's really important, especially in this moment that we're in. So I think, right, we are at a sort of turning point in our time where I think like we have to make a decision and we're going to go one way or another. And I don't, I think we are going to go the way that like centers people. And I am hopeful. And I think that there is a lot that we can accomplish, maybe not in 2026 in Minnesota, but I think there's a lot of work to do. But I am continuing to be hopeful and continuing to do the work because I don't really see another option. So I'm really excited for this conversation and to be here with you all today.
Thanks, Aurora. I really love 100%. Well, there's always one sentence that I associate with you guys. To change everything, we're going to need everybody, and I love that. I think that's just exactly the right attitude. Representative Hollins, you've been an amazing climate champion in Minnesota at the legislature. Tell us a little bit about your work on climate and how you're feeling about Minnesota's chances to make headway on climate change this coming session.
Thanks so much, Erin. Thanks for having me today. I'm really excited to be here and to talk about the possibilities for the future. Yeah, my name is Athena. I represent District 66B, which is the northern neighborhoods of St. Paul. So think Como Park, North End, part of the East Side. And I really came to the legislature in particular to work on climate change issues and climate justice issues. I think it is the defining crisis of our generation. And a story that I often tell is remembering as a child being very concerned with what we then called global warming and asking my parents, like, what should we do? How do we address this? You know, what are our options? We got to do something. And my parents telling me that I shouldn't worry about it and that it'll all be sorted out. And that was, 35 years ago, and it is worse than ever. And now I have my own young kids. And part of the reason I ran for office, a big part of it was that I felt an obligation to do everything within my power to make a difference in the climate crisis. I did not want to look at my kids 35 years from now and say, well, I thought it was going to get sorted out, and sorry, I guess it's your problem now. Um, so I am very passionate about this. I spend most of my time at the legislature doing work in the area of climate and energy and have worked on the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund reauthorization. I have done a bunch of work in systemic geothermal, as well as funding for various organizations that do work in climate adaptation and mitigation. So for me, it's very personal, and I take climate change and climate justice in the same way that you might if you're asking to harm my kids, because that's how I see it, is that this is their future, this is the world where they belong, and they need to be able to have it. right? I brought them into this world and now they need to be able to continue having a place to live. So it's very important to me that we do something to address it as quickly as possible. The other focus that I have is climate justice and environmental justice in particular. And I think it is important always to note that disproportionately impacted individuals are low income and communities of color. We know this. I live in one of those communities. I am kind of stuck between 35E and 94. And so there are higher rates of asthma. There are higher, our water is not as clean. And so one of the things that I struggle with and that I am constantly working towards is how to help individuals who are in those impacted communities understand what climate change is and how it impacts their day-to-day life. And I think when we get into the talk about revenue, that is really where people start to, you can see the engines start to go because they're like, okay, my bills are higher. How do I make sure that I am not paying more for this climate change that I didn't even necessarily, I wasn't the biggest contributor to. So I'm excited to have this conversation today. As far as things happening at the legislature, I think it is going to be difficult to have these conversations, not to have these conversations, but to get anything passed in the legislature this year with a tied House. And we have a number of people in the legislature who, frankly, just deny that climate change is even happening. And so that makes it especially difficult. But one of the things that I tell people, especially constituents, but also just community members and stakeholder groups, is that it's important to socialize these things and to keep having conversations about them. All of the big changes that we made in the past, 5 to 10 years took years and years of bringing them forward, having hearings on them, voting on them. And even when we knew it wasn't going to pass, having those conversations and tweaking them appropriately so that when we did have the opportunity to pass something, we were ready. And so that's what I look forward to doing this upcoming session.
Great. Thank you so much. Lee, turning to you, can you highlight some of MCEA's work on climate in recent years, and what word comes to you, comes to mind for you when you're thinking about the times we're in and what it means for the progress Minnesota can make on climate?
Yeah, thanks, Erin. So Lee Curry, Chief Legal Officer here at MCEA. I have been here about 8 years, and I came here in 2014. So if you are trying to do math, maybe not Aurora, but the rest of you trying to do the math, you'll know that that doesn't add up. And that's because I spent some time in between there at the Attorney General's office, as Erin mentioned. So I left MCEA in 2018 and went to the Attorney General's office and was a special assistant attorney general through a fellowship program. And while I was there, was able to assist with the development and filing of the complaint against some of the big fossil fuel companies. And then I came back to MCEA in 2022 and am now in my new role as Chief Legal Officer. So as Erin mentioned, I think at the outset, we've been working on climate issues at MCEA for decades. A lot of our work has been at the Public Utilities Commission, using existing laws to help lower greenhouse gas emissions, particularly obviously at the Public Utilities Commission from the electricity sector. But we also are at the legislature when needed to create new laws when our existing laws aren't enough. So we were involved with 100% in trying to get the new carbon-free standard passed, and that was necessary to take us to the next level. And in recent years, we've been adding to our work at the administrative branch and in the at the legislature, thinking more about what we can do through litigation. So, how can we use the judicial branch as well to create positive change? And now, we are thinking a lot about how to shift the costs of climate change and climate adaptation away from being borne solely by taxpayers and being borne, at least in part, by those responsible. And in terms of, how I'm feeling right now, I feel like we need to be bold right now. We need to be brave and willing to recognize and wield whatever power we might have in order to make the change that we need.
Really well said. I like that, Lee. So today our webinar is focused on the costs of climate change and what we can do to make sure polluting industries are held responsible. But before we jump in, let's take a step back for just a minute and address why it's so critical that our state has this conversation right now. What's at stake here? What happens if Minnesota doesn't find a way to make sure that industries most responsible for climate change bear some of those costs? And I want to start and kind of direct this question to Representative Hollins to start, because as a state representative, you set the budget, right? And you hear a lot about costs from your constituents. So can you take this one on? What would happen if we don't actually find a way to make those responsible for climate change more responsible for the cost?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question and one that is especially important to constituents and people, just regular folks, because the reality is if the people who are responsible for climate change don't bear that burden, we bear that burden. And that means increased costs for the people who live in Minnesota via taxation, levies, um, honestly, individual costs, right? We think about homes that are maybe not properly insulated or homes that are maybe have leaking happening through their basement because of increased freeze and thaw. Those are costs that just fall on individual people who, even if you're a renter or if you're a homeowner, you end up bearing those costs, right? Increased energy, you're having your XL bill be higher than it really should be because the winters are colder and the summers are hotter. And so I think it is important for us to recognize that there is going to be a cost. And the reality is climate change is getting worse. It is not something that, I mean, we would love to mitigate. We want to stop it. We need to do everything within our power to reduce that. But currently, it is increasing, and we haven't seen the end of those increases. And my real fear right now is that if we don't take a systemic approach on how we are going to deal with these costs, it is going to fall to individual people. And we've seen this, we already see this starting to happen, right? If you think about certain communities that were impacted by, I mean, this is a different example, but this is related. Communities that were impacted by 3M and PFAS being in their water, they are looking at additional levies to be able to have clean drinking water, right? And in addition to things like that, we think of like the Red River Valley flooding, which it floods almost every year now. It didn't used to. And we now have to bear the cost of fixing that up, shoring it up, and making sure that it doesn't flood and repairing those things that damage to houses. The Rapidan Dam that we completely lost, right? That is going to cost millions and millions and millions of dollars. And the reality is, most of the people who are going to be impacted by this increase in cost, it's not their fault. They didn't make billions of dollars off of the fossil fuel industry. And therefore, the people who did make billions of dollars should have to at least help in those costs. As state legislators, when we look at budgets, there are certain things that we can push off and there are certain things that we can't, right? And so if we look at sort of a diagram of what those costs are, what we put money into, education, human services, different places, the question really is, who do we want to borrow from to be able to pay for these damages? Who is going to be impacted? Because do you want your kids to have a less good education because we need to pay for climate change damages? No, nobody wants that. Nobody wants folks to have fewer human services available to them because of climate change. And so because of that, we really need to look at other funding solutions rather than just the people who are here. I think it's important, and usually when I talk to people, both in red and blue districts, they understand this and it resonates with them because they didn't benefit from the increase of climate change, right? They are innocent bystanders of what is happening. And now we need to, the bill has come due. So we have to figure out who's going to pay for that bill. And in my opinion, it shouldn't be the Minnesota taxpayers.
Yeah, well said. Let's get a little bit more detail in the fine grain kind of way about what these costs might be, because we've talked about a couple of things, some of the infrastructural costs, the costs on individuals. And I know that Aurora, you've been looking a lot into these costs. What do we mean by the costs of climate change? What kinds of costs have been accumulating in Minnesota related to climate change, and where are they expected to go in the future? And how are we tracking these costs? Can you give us a sense of what you know about this, Aurora? Because I know you've been tracking this issue for a while now.
Absolutely. So I like to look at like the costs of climate in a like literal and figurative way. And what I mean by that is like there are ways that we are all paying right now, whether we think about it like that or not, right? Like our insurance premiums are rising on our cars and our homes. It could be medical bills, right? Or it could be, time outside with our loved ones when the air quality is too bad for us to actually be outside, right? So, thinking about it in a more holistic way that is, about the physical money, but also getting really weird, really real about like the other costs to us as human beings from the climate crisis, I think is like a really important way to think about this, right? What are we losing out on? Like, what are our loved ones losing out on? I think, there's a whole bunch of research, there's a whole lot of data. Some people have started to calculate the cost of climate by a calculation that is like the loss of global GDP from the climate crisis. We know that in Minnesota between 2010 and 2021, we got on average as the state of Minnesota $29.4 million per year from FEMA and HUD. And that is like just for disaster relief, and that is just reactive, right? We are seeing more and more billion-dollar storms. And a lot of the information that we have right now is retroactive, right? So it is reactive about natural disasters. And when we think about climate, right, there is a lot more to climate change and to fixing it than just recovering from natural disasters, right? So in 2023, the legislature spent $3.5 billion on addressing the climate crisis, which is awesome. And also, only about $1 billion of that is ongoing spending. And that is almost all the metro area sales tax for transit, which is super important. And 3.5 billion in 1 year is not going to cut it, right? I would say I think about like the two different buckets of spending outside of disaster recovery as adaptation and mitigation, right? So how much is it going to cost for us to transition every sector in our economy to carbon neutral? And then adapting, right? How much is it going to cost to literally change everything about the way that we exist so that we can be resilient to the effects of the climate crisis? So in 2023, Representative Hollins chief authored a bill that tasked the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency with actually like starting to dig into how much it's going to cost our state to adapt. And it looks at both, the study is going to look at both like how much it's going to cost us to adapt, but how much it's going to cost us to do nothing, right? Because we know that a lot of times it is more expensive on the front end. It feels more expensive on the front end to make the resilient infrastructure decision. But then down the road, it's 10 times more expensive because it now has to happen on an extremely short timeline, right? We're talking about recovering and reacting. And it is much more expensive because we haven't contained the amount of damage that has happened. So all of that to say is I don't have concrete numbers for you yet, but there's a really exciting report due to the legislature on January 15th. And I am very, very excited for us to actually have these concrete numbers about how much these things are going to cost our state, because I really think about it as like responsible governing, right? Like there is an analogy that I'm still fleshing out, but like when I bring my car to the mechanic, they like tell me a whole list of things that I need to get done, and they tell me how much they're all going to cost, and they tell me how long I have before I actually have to do them, right? Like they say you have to get new brakes today, otherwise your car's not safe to drive. But that you can probably like wait to get your engine flushed for another 6 months, right? So like I would never just like write a blank check to my mechanic, right? At some point, your car is totaled, right? But we don't have that option. Like there's not another place for us to go. The world is not totaled. Like our communities should never be totaled. And so I think about this study as like a way for us to actually responsibly govern. So we know how much it's going to cost, what we need to do. And then I think the next step, right, is for us to figure out like, how do we find that money and where does it come from? Because I don't think it should be coming from, funding our schools or our nursing homes or our healthcare, right? But it has to come from somewhere. And so it's time for us to get creative and figure that all out.
Yeah, it's really, I mean, I think, it's really important too to note that the cost for education and healthcare are both going up in part because of climate change too. I mean, all those bad air quality days we've been having over the last few summers, which are the result of massive wildfires fueled by climate change, are causing people to go to the emergency room. That's costing money. We've got, kids in classrooms that used to be pretty, reasonably cool at the end of August and early September, but now they're having to either install air conditioning at great cost or they're losing learning, quite frankly, because it's really hard to learn when it's 90 degrees in your classroom. Anyway, there's so many ways that this could go, and I'm really kind of fascinated to hear more about it. I also want to turn to Lee for a minute too, because we're going to talk about some potential strategies to shift the burden of these costs on climate change. But let's talk about how we know that certain industries really are responsible for this. And I know that that was part of the case that you were involved in putting together when you were at the Attorney General's office, Lee. Um, can you tell us a little bit more about the evidence that we have in this regard about who's really responsible for these shifts and why they should be held responsible for these costs?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, there was a big surge in climate accountability litigation starting in sort of 2017, 2018 timeframe. And that was really sparked by two really important lines of evidence or research that came to light. So one had to do with tracking emissions. And so there was a paper released in 2020 or 2013. It was by Richard Heed of the Climate Accountability Institute, and it was called Tracing Anthropogenic Carbon Dioxide and Methane Emissions to Fossil Fuel and Cement Producers, 1854 to 2010. The shorthand for that mouthful is it's the carbon majors. So everyone refers to it as the carbon majors report. And this research showed that there are about 20 companies around the globe that are responsible for a third of all climate emissions historically. So 20 companies for all of a third of the historic climate emissions. So it was pretty mind-boggling to actually have this report come out and calculate and show how few entities are really responsible for the bulk of these emissions. The second line of research that came out was in 2015, and this had to do with what companies knew and when did they know it. And so this was investigative journalism. It came out of, I think it was the Columbia School of Journalism, and they uncovered, at that time, it was primarily Exxon documents, and they created this campaign around it called Exxon New. Before this investigative journalism and this research came to light, there were scientists, there were certain politicians, there were really well-informed citizens that knew that what the fossil fuel companies were telling us about climate change wasn't true. So in the early aughts and, up to 20, I don't know, 20, around when this research came out, honestly, then when the fossil fuel companies had to sort of change their tune a little bit. But up until then, we would hear, oh, well, the science is really unsettled. There's no consensus. Some people think climate change is happening, but we're not sure. If it is happening, we're not sure it's fully anthropogenic. It could be natural causes. Well, it could be anthropogenic, but we're not sure the consequences are going to be as catastrophic as you might be hearing. Or maybe the consequences will be catastrophic, but we can't do anything about it now. Or doing something about it now will be just too expensive. I mean, we were hearing all of these different stories from the various fossil fuel companies, but we didn't know until 2015 that they knew better. That was the thing. It was like we were fighting them and saying, no, you're wrong, and look at this evidence and look at this climate change science. But we didn't realize that they knew all along that what they were saying was not true. And this research really uncovered that. They knew that there was a consensus. They knew why it was happening. They knew that it was going to be really bad. They knew that at some point it might be too late to stop it. And, when this came out in 2015, it really fueled people's anger, and it led to a lot of climate accountability litigation. We could have been fighting, instead of climate change is real, we could have been talking about what to do about it, which solution is the best for society, who should pay for it. And then the other piece of what came out is that they not only knew better, but they developed a very intentional strategy to obfuscate the truth, and spent a lot of time and energy into confusing the public, and that this whole lack of consensus, and we don't know exactly what the science is telling us, was very deliberate in order to delay, confuse, and make sure that nobody took action against their bottom line, and make sure their profits were not affected. So, there are now many attempts to bring some of that accountability through our judicial system.
And one of those examples is the 2020, I think it was 2020 when the lawsuit was filed from the state of Minnesota against the oil industry. As you mentioned, there's a number of different lawsuits, and I'm wondering if you just give us a brief update about where that lawsuit is and what's happening with that right now.
Yeah, so as you said earlier, it's like right now the parties are literally at the Minnesota Court of Appeals doing oral argument in the Minnesota versus Exxon, American Petroleum Institute, and Koch Industries case. So I will be catching up on that after this webinar to figure out how that played out. But yeah, so in 2020, Minnesota filed it was essentially a consumer protection lawsuit. So the claims in that case are all focused on protecting consumers that in a way that ensures, that companies don't deceive consumers about their product in a goal of increasing their profit or of meeting their bottom line. As you said, it was filed June 2020. It's now November of 2025. We certainly don't have a final judgment. The defendants really challenged every aspect of the suit, starting with whether it should be in state or federal court. That took several years, and the U.S. Supreme Court weighing in before we had that resolved in the state's favor. It's now in state court. The defendants filed a motion to dismiss for other reasons, and the Ramsey County District Court denied almost all of the bases that they raised for trying to get it dismissed. And that two of those bases that the defendants raised, the defendants are now, and by defendants, I mean the big oil companies, they're now appealing that to the Minnesota Court of Appeals. So, apparently there's no shortage of money to pay lawyers to avoid being held accountable. So now we want some of that money to go toward actually paying for the cost of climate change. But the hearing at the Court of Appeals was today, so we should know the next ruling within 90 days of what's happening in Minnesota. And then, there are a lot of cases in other states as well, some of which are further along than Minnesota's. I think the furthest along is one that was brought in the state of Hawaii by the county of Honolulu. There are a couple others that are battling through discovery, so meaning that the state plaintiffs survived any motions to dismiss, and now they're able to get information out of the big oil companies. Massachusetts, Vermont, they're in the discovery stages. So there's a few that are further along. None of these climate deception cases have gotten to a final resolution. There was one in New York City that did, but it was on a slightly different theory. And then the last thing I'll note is that, the big oil fossil fuel companies are not the only sector of the economy that has been accused of deceiving the public about climate change. There are fewer of these types of cases, but there are at least two cases I'm aware of against major meat producers, for example, for their alleged role in greenwashing their products to try to get more people to consume and buy more meat. So fossil fuel companies are definitely the major players, and they are the architects, I would say, of this strategy, but they're not alone in this deception.
Thanks. Well, that's a really useful and helpful summary of all that. And there's a lot of action that's been happening there. But as you note, like we started these cases 7, 8, 9 years ago in some cases, and we're not even really to the meat of them yet. That's how slow some of these litigation strategies can go. And I know that there are a lot of other ways that states and even other countries are trying to ensure that polluting industries pay for climate costs, not just through litigation, but through other means too. And I just want to turn to what some of those might be. And I know, Aurora, you've been doing a lot of research into this. Can you tell us about some of these strategies that are being pursued across the country and maybe internationally to try to ensure that climate change's costs are being imposed on the actual causers of those changes?
Absolutely. So I have three sort of main solutions that I think are worth digging into. So the first one is a carbon tax. Most folks are probably pretty familiar with it. It is sort of a concept that you pay to emit. It doesn't say that a company can only emit a certain amount of emissions, right, of greenhouse gas emissions. But it does say for any emissions that they do put out into our air, they have to pay our government for it. There are 27 countries that currently have carbon taxes, including Canada, Argentina, and a bunch of European countries. I think that this one is probably the most well-known solution. Currently, there aren't any states in the United States who have passed a carbon tax, but there are multiple states who are trying. One that is very popular, and there is a lot of organizing happening around, is this cap and invest or cap and trade. So basically, it is this concept that a company is allowed to emit this much CO2, and anything that they emit after that, they either have to pay for or trade another company for who hasn't met their cap. So this does regulate greenhouse gas emissions to an extent, right? Like you can still emit more, but you do have to pay, right? So one thing that I think a lot about, right, is I have gotten into the revenue space in the last couple of years. And one of the considerations that we think about is how much money is this thing going to raise, right? So I think both the carbon tax and a cap and trade program or a cap and invest program would really absolutely raise a lot of money, but it's not necessarily if the goal is to emit less carbon, is it a sustainable revenue source to continue to make money off of the emissions? And that's something that I think we're going to have to dig into and figure out. The third solution that I want to talk about today is the one that I am the most excited about. So it's called the Climate Superfund. The states that have already passed it are New York and Vermont, and I believe there are 11 other states with efforts currently going. But it is this idea of cost recovery. So this also would only raise a certain amount of money because it is specifically looking at the damages caused by specific fossil fuel companies for their share of greenhouse gas emissions. So it is retroactive. It's based off of our federal Superfund program, right, where a company was responsible for a mess. I grew up in West Duluth, where we live right on the St. Louis River, and we are a climate Superfund or a Superfund site. Literally, like companies were dumping into the St. Louis Bay, and they are currently still. They have done a whole bunch of pollution cleanup that the companies who are actually responsible for that pollution are paying for. It makes a lot of sense, right? Like if you make a mess, you clean it up. That is a whole cultural childhood lesson that like we have all been taught. So shouldn't fossil fuel companies also stand by that, right? So this solution is really exciting, and also it is retroactive only. So the way that it works is a state agency figures out the total cost of climate damages for the state of Minnesota or whatever state we're talking about. And then another state agency figures out like which companies are responsible and how much they're responsible for. So their share of that bill is the same as their share of emissions that they have produced and profited off of. So I think that it is a really exciting solution, and we're seeing it get a lot of traction in other states. New York and Vermont are the states that have passed it. They're both being sued by the fossil fuel industry, which is not surprising. But they have done really interesting work to make sure that their legal argument is as sound as humanly possible, to make it stand up in court. So we will see how that all plays out, but I think that is a very exciting opportunity. And then another couple of things, right? So in addition to thinking about how much money a revenue solution will raise, like sort of, is the juice worth the squeeze? All of these things will be a big fight to pass, right? Are they going to raise enough revenue to actually make that fight worth it? So that's like a consideration. And then are they progressive or regressive? We hear about this a lot in the revenue world. It basically just means like, are the people who are paying the most or the same people who have the most, or are we being regressive and targeting the same folks that are experiencing climate change first and worst with our revenue raising solutions? So those are just a couple of important considerations.
Well, that's really helpful, and thanks for sharing all that information, because I think we're going into this, here in Minnesota, trying to think about what have other folks done and what have they learned. But in order to do any of that, you need political will, right? You need to have, kind of the direction you want here. What would it take for Minnesota to do stuff like this, Representative Hollins? What do you think? I mean, is this an actual prospect here in Minnesota? And if you can see it happening here, what's the first step we should be taking to try to make it happen?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And it's one that's really, really important because, as Aurora kind of pointed out, right, if the juice is worth the squeeze, is this juice worth the squeeze? Because we know it's going to be a fight at the legislature. In this case, I do actually think that it's worth it. And I think there's real potential here. And part of it is because of what I was saying earlier. When you talk to people, both in red and blue districts, they agree they shouldn't have to pay for the damages that are happening that somebody else made millions and billions of dollars off of. And because of that, it does resonate across the political spectrum. So when we talk to regular people, they get it. They don't want to see their budget be impacted by this. Now, when you talk to legislators that represent those people across the political spectrum, that's where it gets a little bit tricky because of the money that is poured into this issue. And so to piggyback off of what Lee was saying with the cost of going into litigation and how they clearly have money to litigate these things for years and years and years, they also have money to lobby and to enhance lawmakers with political donations that then impact their clear-headedness about what to do when this comes up for a vote. So I do think it has real potential because the regular people get it. Constituents, Minnesotans get it. It is the people who are at the Capitol who are going to be fighting against their own constituencies. And I think as we progress onward in time, it will become ever more clear because as people's personal income and personal budgets start being impacted by this, as if their tax rates go up because of it, if their insurance rates go up because of it, they are going to be coming to their legislators and saying, why are you allowing this to happen when somebody else could be footing the bill for this and it's in front of you and you can vote for it? Why would you say that no, my constituents who are barely making ends meet should actually be the ones footing the bill? And I think that's really the question. And that's the question that we need regular Minnesotans to ask their legislators across the entire state. They have to be loud and they have to know that it is an option that their legislators are potentially ignoring or voting against. And I think that that is really, I mean, it's to me, the Superfund is actually one of the easiest and most palatable things that we bring to the legislature, especially because you don't have to even, we, like I said, we have representatives and senators who deny that climate change is even real. That's fine. Deny it's real. It doesn't matter because what matters is when the river in your district floods every year, you still have to rebuild it. If you think that it's not because of climate change, that's fine. But this is dedicated revenue that would help to rebuild your community. And only a fool would say no to that. So, yeah, I really do think it has potential.
That's great to hear. Aurora, I know you've been working on a project too to kind of gather some of these climate stories. Can you talk briefly about that? And we can toss a link about that in the chat too.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, um, when I think about how we get things done, right? Power is a big part of that. And when I think about power, I think about organized people and organized money, right? The fossil fuel industry has lots of money and lots of ways to organize it, right? As Representative Holland said, they can spend money on lobbying, they can spend money on campaigns, right? They have no shortage of money. Um, but what they don't have is people, right? Like, in order for us to make the progress that we need to make, we have to get really organized. And I think a lot of times, right, like people care about the climate crisis, but they don't always know what to do about it or like how they can actually have an impact, right? Because they may not be a scientist. They might not know all of the facts. They might really care about the climate crisis, but they don't actually understand like what are the things that we need to do beyond like recycling and our own carbon footprints, which was also a thing that the fossil fuel industry funded to make all of us pay attention to ourselves instead of them, right? So the biggest impact that like regular people can actually have is to share their own stories and how it's impacting them. So the link that we're going to share in the chat is literally just a story collection form, right? Like we want to hear from people about how these very real problems are affecting them because, right, like we can raise a lot of money. We'll keep trying to raise a lot of money, but the billions of dollars in profits that the fossil fuel industry has in their bank account is, quite a steep um, cliff for us to reach. But we do have people, right? Like more people are disadvantaged by the climate crisis than the fossil fuel industry is benefiting, right? So we would love to hear your stories. We would love for you to think about ways that the climate crisis is impacting you, how it's costing you, and who you think should be paying for it. Maybe you have ideas about different revenue solutions that we're not thinking about, or different ways to get this money to pay for the things we know we need that we're not thinking about. So it's all about getting organized, and it will start with you just sharing your story with us.
Awesome. So we've got about 10 minutes left, and I do want to turn to a few of these questions. We're not going to be able to get to all of these amazing questions that are in the chat, but I want to ask a few that seem important and maybe ones that we can help folks out with. One is about a present opportunity. There was actually a link in the chat earlier during the webinar about the climate action framework that the state of Minnesota is currently working on, and it's right now out for public comment. And one of our attendees asks, do the panelists have thoughts about how this climate action framework can be made more actionable for the state of Minnesota? And I just turn that over to folks who would like to take that one on.
Yeah, I can start and then I'll let others chime in. So the first climate action framework was developed in 2022, and this is an update to it that with comments open through Sunday. And I do think one of the downsides of it, I think it's a good effort. It's trying to lay out economy-wide, like what are the things Minnesota needs to do to reach our goal as a state to be net zero emissions by 2050? How can we get there? Where it falls short, I think, and where comments might be helpful is that there aren't really identified policy steps that the state is recommending in order to achieve these action items, right? So they say things like limit the amount of nitrogen fertilizer or reduce the amount of nitrogen fertilizer, but there's nothing in there that says a first step would be to measure how much we're putting on or to record sales of fertilizer. Like some of those next steps are really missing.
Got it. Aurora or Athena, do you have other thoughts you want to add to that? People, right now you can make these comments right now. So there's a link in the chat. Are there any other thoughts about this you want folks to toss in the hopper?
If folks are making comments, there are a couple of places. I think one thing that I think that that the climate action framework should talk more about that it doesn't really touch on is data centers and the role that they are playing, the threats that they bring, and also how we can use them to the advantage of regular Minnesotans to help solve the climate crisis, right? Like, can we use them for